streaming and make sure that it's actually running. There we go. Okay. Make sure sound is working. Sound, where are you? Okay, good. Right. So we ended here. Lots of disease. You know, we had this lovely cholera thing here. Lots of awful stuff in the streets. We had this lovely dead horse and the children playing near it because, you know, beating a dead horse was a pastime back then. Yeah, disease. The water was not great. And that was a major part of trying to maintain sanitation, was having clean water. And considering sewage was dumped into the water, and a lot of times that sewage was like factory waste, sometimes the water would catch on fire. So, you know, not great. And then, of course, you had crime. These cramped conditions, bad wages, etc., led a lot of folks to lives of crime. We had these rough neighborhoods. Jesus, it's loud. Various bad areas. Let's see, was that another? No, it's just another email. Let's see. I just got a bunch of these mug shots and whatnot. Okay, so on to the next section. So the way the cities were run politically, the state and federal government tended to stay out of city businesses, and the mayors themselves often didn't hold a lot of power, and they were the ones that were supposed to be running the cities. So we had a lot of private companies that ran things, which led to a lot of unnecessary duplication and competition, which I know today it's like, yeah, you can only get, say, electricity from one company and they set the price and that's it. Could certainly be better, but back then there was, say, 1890 Chicago, 11 separate branches of government that all were at odds with each other, so things weren't run especially smoothly. So there was the political machine. Branches of government were pulled under a central authority. This political machine boss at the top. And in order to maintain power, which is to say, have people voting for them, they usually practice limited welfare, pass out turkeys on holidays, cold during the winter. They provided shelter and meals if a tenement burned down, which was fairly common. The bosses themselves would attend barbecues, picnics, christenings, bar mitzvahs, weddings, funerals, etc. And a number of immigrants, in particular the Irish, were able to find upward mobility by working with these political machines. Local businesses also profited by working with the machines. They were able to cut through red tape, often overlapping red tape, because again, with these various competing branches of the city government, you'd have, you know, a certain type of tax or whatever you had to pay, but then this other version of it, you had to do the same thing for them. So with the political machines and the bosses, they were able to just get rid of that for you. Now, this didn't just apply to, this guy that sells cigars out of this corner store. It also applied to businesses that dealt in vice. When Prohibition came around, the speakeasies, gambling fronts, prostitution, etc. So, needless to say, boy, there was a lot of corruption in these political machines. Lots of voting fraud, including the so-called graveyard vote, which people still clutch their pearls about. It's very not common anymore. Phony names of businesses to funnel funds. The political machine bosses were just barely above organized crime. And, really just barely above organized crime. One of the most famous of these political machine bosses was Boss Tweed. In counting their strength, he says, that's what's the matter. As long as I count the votes, what are you going to do about it? I'd argue that the Spider-Man, well, he actually wasn't a Spider-Man villain originally. He was the Daredevil villain, Kingpin. I'd say he was modeled after Boss Tweed and political machine bosses more so than like a mafia boss. And then we've got him in that same position, but now in stripes and behind bars. Bribery and corruption under her nose every day of the week. Because, justice is blind, so as long as you're quiet about it, get away with whatever. So again, just a side I blatantly stole here. Political machines are parties of a powerful boss who control a network of politicians. I've actually got this image larger, so I'll show you that in a minute. Rally citizens, especially immigrants, to vote for them by offering services. Here in the South, we have, pig pickings. I've never seen a whole ass cow just get carved up at one of these things. So that's interesting. So here's that image again. The party boss handing out special privileges, immunity to arrest, franchise, police protection, that sort of thing. Again, very not quite legal stuff, but working within the legal system to make advantages for those that work with them. So that led to our last slide for the chapter, which actually perfectly leads into the next chapter. It's quite nice. Urban reformers. So in response to all the corruption of the political machines and the bosses of said political machines, there were certain urban reformers who wanted to actually fix the root of the problems rather than just their symptoms. So for, say, the people that were starving, rather than giving them turkeys on Christmas or on Thanksgiving, actually helping them find jobs that made it so they could afford food, rather than have to rely on like holiday food to be able to eat at least some portion of the year. 1883, Congress passed the Pension and Civil Reform Act, required federal jobs to be awarded based on merit as opposed to simply knowing someone in the system. Yeah, that law's been largely ignored. Federal jobs are still largely awarded because you know somebody. There were reformers who set up settlement houses in the slums to provide aid and education to those living in squalor. Immigrants went to taverns and political machines not because they were racially inferior, but because of their suffering left them nowhere to go. This is a major part of the next chapter, the settlement houses. So I'm not going to go into substantial detail with that just yet. We'll talk about the settlement houses and Jane Addams, etc. Next chapter. There was also religious-inspired reform, rather than Russell Conwell's emphasis on getting rich. These reformers felt that this unfettered capitalism was unequitable because it left many more people poor than it did wealthy. Still, though, the settlement houses and the charity actions of the church were not enough to deal with the teeming masses. And as we're going to see in the next chapter, it required large government action to actually deal with the population. So we'll get to that in just a moment. So here's an image from this idea of urban reform. It's weird that in recent years this could be seen as something controversial because we've gone back like 150 years in how we look at technology and medicine. Popular education about disease, careful physicians, efficient health officers, isolation and quarantine of the sick, weird. Antitoxin, which is to say vaccines. Fumigation and disinfection, which is to say keeping shit clean. Whooping cough, measles, diphtheria, scarlet fever. A lot of preventable diseases. Hell, we've had a couple of diseases coming back because of certain anti-vax weirdos. There's something that came back recently that should have been gone. I think it was measles. They came back in small numbers because people were just like not doing vaccines at all. It was measles, wasn't it? Yeah. And then over here we have, the children being protected by this wall of people who have a brain. Anyway, I like the, I can't tell if that's a cat or a dog this child is dancing with. Whatever it is, it seems to be getting along okay. I guess that's a dog. Either way, it's got a bobtail. This is a settlement house. I think this one was in London. They were largely used, this is inside one, to educate and care for the children of those in the slums, usually immigrants. One of the main things was teaching them how to read because, well, if you're a child of an immigrant from another country that can't read English, then you're probably not going to learn how to read English. But if you are taken into one of these settlement houses and taught how to read when you're at a young age and you're able to absorb all this stuff, it gives you a leg up on being able to learn. So here again, more settlement house stuff. I'll show you more of that in the next chapter. I think I've actually got a picture of Jane Addams. Oh, that's not Jane Addams. Getting children a bath in these. They look more like big sinks than tubs, which I find amusing. Good stuff. Oh, no Jane Addams. Okay. On to the next chapter, which will be the last chapter for the test. Progressivism and the Search for Order, which, as you can see, 1900 to 1917, technically goes through World War I. Well, almost through World War I. Really up until our involvement. We were barely involved in World War I. So we'll get into that in the chapter after this. So after our next test, we'll talk about wars and stuff. We were involved in other wars a lot more than we were in the First World War. So let's talk about, when I get to it, progressivism. So all these changes, expanding the cities, industrialization, urbanization, immigration, etc., had greatly changed the face of the country. And then with the economic collapse in the 1890s, which we've already talked about, many middle and upper class Americans believed that there was some root cause to all this change and, the economic collapse that needed to be changed, or else America itself was going to collapse as well. And as we saw with the cities, the people at the time were not ignorant of what was going on. 1912, progressive newspaper editor wrote, "The world moves and we have to move with it. So with all that is going on with politics today, it is evolution, not revolution. It's not something we should be afraid of. It's change that is happening and we have to move with it. It's not some big, terrifying, explosive change. It's a gradual but inevitable change that we need to go along with. We can't be isolationist about it." And once again, we look back to the populists. Progressive ideals often inherited those that were brought along by the populists. They attacked the ideas of laissez-faire, they wanted to reduce the power of monopolies, and they wanted an income tax. One of the ways they were different was that the populists were largely focused on rural America. For some reason that word trips me up. The farmers, while progressives were more interested in urban and industrial stuff. So, where most of the people were at this point in time. So, as I've said since the start of the semester, you see how things build on each other. That's why it's important to kind of keep certain parts of each chapter in mind. We've got the populists, we've got the cities and immigrants in the previous chapter. Now we're building on top of that. So where progressivism came from, it was heavily influenced by pragmatism, which is one of many schools of thought. If you ever take my 104 course, the second European history course, we go through schools of thought. Feels like every other decade in that course. Romanticism and utilitarianism and just feels like, just the last chapter we were on was just those two alone. Just various schools of thought. Pragmatism, absolute truth was not an idea that you got from a doctrine, not some holy book that said this is how things are and this is how you have to be, but from experience. Your ideas came from practical consequence, and thus progressives and pragmatists as a whole were skeptical of rigid dogma, relied on human experience. So pragmatism, just from the word, if you're going to do something, say this example I used yesterday, if you're going to say build a railroad through a town, and it's going to disrupt, say, 3 businesses because the path that it takes is going to cause these 3 businesses to move. That's going to disrupt their business because they've got to move their stores somewhere else. But that railroad is going to bring in X amount of business to that town. It's going to create so many jobs, and it's going to benefit many more people than the 3 businesses it's going to disrupt. Then the pragmatic move would be to build that railroad because it's going to help more people than it's going to hurt. That's the idea. There are also progressive ideals coming from religion, like the social gospel. In Christianity and Social Crisis, Walter Rauschenbusch, I'm just going to assume, wanted Christians to embrace the teachings of Jesus, the ethical obligations of social justice, and work among the poor. Because, as I said yesterday, what was Jesus if not a social worker? I feel like that's probably a pretty good shorthand for the stuff Jesus got up to. Middle class also grew, which raised the need for the standard of professionalism. A number of groups were created or at least expanded during this time. One group that the book gives as an example is the American Medical Association, which technically had been founded earlier, 1847, sorry. But around 1900, it grew significantly, raised professional qualifications. Basically, doctors had to be more qualified in order to be a doctor. So, probably a good thing. In the mid-1800s, you'd go to a town and the doctor would also be the town's butcher and barber because he had access to all the sharp tools. Here, at least, that's now something a little bit separate. So we have actually we have a quote here. To furnish outlet for just and to found an outlet for just and wisely directed social energies inspired by teachings in the churches and by the study of social problems in the colleges. So this is bringing together both pragmatism and social gospel. This is progressivism as a whole. So you're seeing this alleyway full of impoverished children and being like, okay, we can do something with this. We can help them. We can help them not just because it's the right thing to do, but also because making their lives better now will make the city and the people as a whole better down the road. Because if they're not impoverished, they won't turn to crime, and if they're educated and they see the city as something that gave to them, they'll want to give back, and thus they'll be good citizens and make the city a better place as they get older. So it's both for the good of the people, but also for the good of everybody. So here we have, I think this is the start of the social gospel. I thought this was Jane Addams at first, actually. But there's Jane Addams, teaching these children how to read. We'll talk more about Jane Addams in a little bit. Because while I thought that the settlement houses were immediate, that we actually have to talk about the muckrakers first. So we'll get to that. Gotham Court, again, these dark alleyways in typically New York. The dark parts of New York were called Gotham. Here's the American Medical Association. What's neat about this picture, besides the fact that, hey, it's a photograph, and I feel like photographs from this era were pretty neat, and a big group photograph too, is that a number of the people in this photograph are women. You've got women in this American Medical Association. So that's pretty cool. I mean, the majority of them are men still, but the fact that there's women in there at all, and not like put to one corner, it's like this is where the women are, and then the rest are the men. They're just like interdispersed throughout. They're there. They're just part of the group. I feel like that's pretty cool. I think this is the AMA talking to FDR. All right, on to muckrakers. So this is the term for investigative journalists who sought to expose corruption of the government, shady dealings with corporations. That was the main thing they did. There was other stuff they got up to, but mostly investigative journalist stuff. McClure's and Collier's were magazines that made a lot of money by sharing the stuff these journalists dug up. Wow, should go to this next one real quick. Come on. Now, this investigative work took a lot of effort. They had to go out and not just do like research, but a lot of times they had to go to the places they were researching that often did not want them there. It was like detective work, but you weren't an officer of the law. A lot of times they had to like break into places or sneak into places. It was harrowing work. The things that they exposed carried a sensationalist appeal, informed and aroused the excitement of the middle-class readers. Journalist Ida Tarbell hit on the ruthless and dishonest business practices of the Rockefeller family Standard Oil Company. Lincoln Steffens wrote on the machine bosses. Ida B. Wells brought the horrors of lynching of African Americans to the forefront of many readers' minds. We're going to talk about Ida B. Wells because she's got a lot more to say. Others uncovered fraudulent practices with insurance companies, child labor, drug abuse, prostitution, etc. There were a lot of fictional novels written during this period where the protagonist was an investigative journalist, because that was the easiest way to like get a person that wouldn't be familiar with whatever weirdness was going on into that weird scenario. So the easiest example is most of Lovecraft's weird shit. A lot of the protagonists in his works were investigative journalists. Like, hey, I heard about some weird cult stuff going on. I'm going to go find out. And boy, they found out. Whether they survived or not was usually a coin toss. But investigative journalists were very often the protagonists in stories from the early 1900s. You good, Nia? I mean, the air outside is 90% pollen, so. I mean, I'm not allergic, and it's just, I can feel it in my throat. Ironically, the term muckrakers came from the progressive president Theodore Roosevelt. He compared these journalists to the character in Paul Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, who's too busy looking at the filth or the muck on the ground and missed the gift presented to him. I haven't read Pilgrim's Progress in probably 20 years, so I don't remember what he's referring to. But the short version of this is he was worried that all this sensationalism in these journals and magazines would threaten the moderate reform that Roosevelt was trying to do. Because Roosevelt, while being known as a rather exciting, eccentric individual, as far as his politics, he was fairly moderate. I mean, he did want reform, and he did obtain, I should say, quite a bit of progressive reform. But he kept it moderate. He didn't push for too much craziness. Not like his cousin, who we'll see as we get past World War I. That said, Roosevelt was often depicted with a muckrake, as you see here. And one of the most famous bits of muckrake was the meat scandal. Let's see if I've got a picture of that. I'll actually get that in a minute. McClure's Magazine, Pittsburgh, A City of Shame. Lincoln Steffens, I suppose there's another type of municipal grifting. The End of the World by somebody Newcomb, powerful story, that scientific prediction, yada, yada, yada. There's Ida Tarbell. Southern Tactics, yada, yada, yada. Oil crisis, right. Here's McClure's again. This one you can read easier. Labor Boss, Trust New Tool, New York by Lincoln Steffens. Truth About Radium. Oh, the poor radium girls. Yeah, long story short, the way they made clocks to glow at night was to use radium. And radium's, well, if you can tell from the name, radioactive. And they just had people like making the clocks with radium, and they were usually young women. And then, oh no, they're dying from cancer. I wonder why this is happening. Here's a magazine, newspaper, sorry. This one's about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, if you can tell. Woman tells of fight for life at barred door. Who is responsible? Probably the asshole who barred the door. Here we go. The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. This was the meat scandal a couple of pictures ago. So if you've not read The Jungle, or if you're not familiar with The Jungle at least, this was an expose on the conditions of the meatpacking plants in America at the time. And let me tell you, while you probably don't want to think about what the meatpacking plants look like today, because they're still pretty gross, back then there were no standards. There were no safety standards. There were no sanitation standards. If someone got their arm cut off and it went into the meat, well, guess somebody's getting arm meat. A lot of the cans weren't properly sealed, so there was a lot of people getting poisoned from the meat. Once this was made public, Europe actually completely refused to buy meat from America until this was taken care of. It was a big deal. So yeah, good old Upton Sinclair. All right, Now, we finally get to the settlement houses, Jane Addams, and the Hull House, which was the name of the first settlement house in America. Right, so, talk about settlement houses. Jane Addams established the first settlement house, the Hull House in Chicago, in 1889. She's going to remain important. And while settlement houses cropped up all over the place after this, both as satellites of the Hull House and just as independent ventures, we're going to focus on the Hull House and Jane Addams, because that's just easier. Many women who worked at those settlement houses or established new ones were college graduates who were shut out of male-dominated jobs. Jane Addams called on them to take up what she calls civic housekeeping, to protect their households from the chaos of urbanization by attacking the sources of the chaos at the root. So again, rather than just treating the symptoms of what they saw as the chaos of urbanization, let's fix the problem itself. Let's fix why people are impoverished, why these people are living in the slums. Let's help them rise above their lot in life. So off the back of this, women's clubs began to work in the political sphere, eventually brought together under the General Federation of Women's Clubs in 1890. They believed that men were distracted by politics and business, so they had to take on the burden of civic duties. Apparently, men were so bad at multitasking that they were just letting the cities go to shit. Sure, why not? Now, needless to say, if they're the ones doing all the civic work, they're going to also work to make things less crap for women. So they lobby for shorter hours, benefits for widows, child labor laws, increased health care for mothers. Because there's still a whole lot of women dying at childbirth sort of thing. Let's avoid that if we can. So here's the Hull House early on. Nice, sturdy building. This is the historic, visitor center, I guess. They were going to tear it down. Chicago's always growing. But the citizens of Chicago nearly rioted. They were like, no, you're not tearing down the whole house. That's part of our history. So they had a vote and the Hull House stayed. So you can go and visit that today in Chicago. It's a big cultural landmark. I've been to Chicago, just like the train station there. But it was cold and I didn't feel like leaving the train station. But I guess I should have sought out the Hull House. So there's Jane Addams again, teaching the kids how to read. Real simple children's books, but basic reading stuff. I think this is very basic weaving. Let me get my mouse. I think that's what that is that she's holding. It teaches you how to work thread together. These are the old actual trying to think of the proper term. I mean, I don't know what the proper term is. Like the actual weaving machines from like the 1700s, where you could turn the threads into actual cloth. And while, that wasn't something you might need for a job anymore with the industrialized textile mills, this would be good for something to know at home, for like patching your clothing. Because while Jane Addams was trying to help these kids get out of poverty, a lot of them were still probably going to be in a place where buying new clothes is going to be difficult, or at least, very expensive for them. So being able to patch old clothes would be a very good skill to have. And hey, cooking too. Big old home ec class right there. All right. Needless to say, the next move was women's suffrage, again. So until 1910, women could only vote in a few states in the West. And again, that was only like local and state elections. There was no kind of national vote. And as we saw with the 14th and 15th Amendments, there was a divide on if they should support that at all, because technically that only allowed for black men to vote and it left women out. So eventually the National Women's Suffrage Association and the American Women's Suffrage Association combined in 1890 to form the National American Women's Suffrage Association, because let's just squish the names together. And by 1918, women could vote in 15 states and the territory of Alaska, because I guess we had Alaska now, and if you wanted to live there, you could vote. Now, if we're combining these two associations that were not in agreement back when the 14th and 15th Amendments were being passed, now that they're together, we have a broad range of reasonings for the right for women to vote. So we've got Jane Addams, who again, of course, she's still around, she's still doing her thing, and she's involved here. She saw the vote as a natural continuation for civic housekeeping. Hey, if we're going to make cities a better place, we should be able to speak on politics, because they affect cities. Others, like Alice Paul, wanted to vote on the basis of equality with men rather than subservience, because for Jane Addams, it was more about it was still like the model of the household where women are just sort of the helpers for the men, and while they'd be able to vote, it would still be just part of this civic housekeeping, where it's just, we can't do stuff and then also not have a voice. Whereas Alice Paul is like, no, equal rights, period. In fact, she founded the National Women's Party, fought for the Congress to adopt an Equal Rights Amendment to give women full legal equality, which I feel like she would be screaming if 100 years after that we still don't quite have that. Thank you, Supreme Court. New Zealand, Australia, and Norway were well ahead of the United States. New Zealand in 1893, Australia 1902, and Norway 1913 all passed women's suffrage. But eventually the United States passed the 19th Amendment in 1919, giving women the right to vote. Now, obviously, this is after most of the stuff we're going to talk about this chapter, so for most of this chapter, women aren't going to have the right to vote nationally, but we're just going to go ahead and put it in this section so we don't have to talk about it like in a single point later on. It's like, oh yeah, by the way, women have the right to vote now. Moving on. So we have another one of these wonderful signs with like 4 different fonts on it. Women's Suffrage Headquarters, Men of Ohio, give women a square deal. That was in reference to Teddy Roosevelt's campaign, his square deal. Vote for Amendment number 23, yada yada. Come in and learn why women ought to vote. And they're still marching with President Wilson, who came after Taft, in fact. So that's 2 presidents after Roosevelt. Here's a picture that has a lot of dangerous energy in it. So we have the headquarters of the National Association opposed to women's suffrage, and you have a lady walking by here looking back, and this guy is realizing he may be in danger, which, you know, yep. Did I have any more on this? Yes. Made an amendment to the United States Constitution, enfranchising women. This is World War II. Women work, women vote. That's 1944. A self-respecting woman should wish or work for the success of a party that ignores her sex. Susan B. Anthony. And this is an interesting image here. Because as I've said a couple of times, usually, especially with like technology and stuff, you would have things moving from east to west. You would have electricity, you know, starting in, say, New York, and heading west. You'd have, you know, anti-slavery starting in the northeast and then heading west. But when it came to the woman's right to vote, it started in the west and headed east. So here we have the Awakening, Votes for Women, and it's got a little mouse. Okay, it's got a little poem down here. All right. Let's do a little more. So women in Illinois was trying to gain some level of social equality. African Americans were actually getting worse treatment as time went on. Voter disenfranchisement, lynching, race riots were keeping them away from the polls. So while on paper black men were able to vote, in reality they were being, disenfranchised at the polls and also physically forced away / killed. So yeah, it wasn't exactly equality. So the leaders of the day approached this in different ways. We had Booker T. Washington, founded Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, and did a whole lot of interesting things with science and whatnot. He wanted blacks to accept segregation, work on moral and economic development, and just to stay out of politics. Just, work internally, but he also tasked whites with making good on their promise of protecting blacks from race-related violence. So it's like, okay, we'll stay out of politics, but you guys have to stop with the lynching. Now, I believe he secretly financed and supported court challenges to electoral disenfranchisement, railroad segregation, jury discrimination, and forced labor to repay debt. So he still did a lot of stuff like behind the scenes. He wasn't just, hey, let's just accept our place and move on. Obviously not everybody was content with the status quo. Ida B. Wells, hey, remember her from like a couple of slides ago? Well, she's back. She wrote for the Free Speech newspaper, investigated lynching and racial inequality, spoke out against it, let everybody know about how bad things were. And in response, her newspaper's building got burned down. So she went up to Chicago and just kept doing what she was doing. Because Ida B. Wells, as you're going to see here in a minute from the picture that I have of her, don't give a fuck. She was something else. Then lastly, we have W.E.B. Du Bois, who, again, we've talked about. I told you we were going to talk about him again. And he was very prominent at this time. Wanted immediate suffrage, helped to found the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP. They managed to have the Supreme Court strike down the grandfather clause, which very specifically discriminated against black voters. Depending on the state, in some states it was the literacy test didn't apply to you if your grandfather could read, so it only applied to black voters. In some cases, it was if your grandfather couldn't vote, then you can't vote, and obviously that only applied to people whose grandfathers were slaves, which only applied to black voters. So yeah, it was very clearly biased. So I've got some really good quotes here from these three. Booker T. Washington, 2 ways of exerting one's strength. One is pushing down, the other is pulling up. Associate yourself with good people of good quality, for it is better to be alone than in bad company. You know, it was weird. I was actually speaking about this to a couple of students in here before class started. With the way state education is, these three people were very important, but I only heard about one of them growing up. And it happened to be the one that didn't want to cause any waves. Weird how that is with how state education is. So speaking of people who wanted to cause waves, here's Ida B. Wells. The way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them. She looks like she's ready to fight. I like Ida B. Wells. One had better die fighting against injustice than to die like a dog or a rat in a trap. And then we go back to Mr. Du Bois. A system cannot fail those it was never meant to protect, which is a hell of a statement, and it's also true because the system, especially in the South, was not meant to protect black Americans. It wasn't failing them. It was working as intended. It was meant to protect white slave owners. So it had to be changed. And that's what they were trying to do. Power of the ballot we need in sheer defense. What else shall save us from a second slavery? Also, here we have his his lifespan here at the bottom, he lived until 1963. He made it up till the Civil Rights era, so he got to see the start, at least, of when some level of equality was reached. But man, he was almost 100. He was 95. Okay, let's go a little further to try to get you guys a little closer to my other class. So these progressive reforms sometimes push a little further than social reform into social control. It was the immorality of the poor that caused social disorder, so they wanted to impose their own social norms on them. Prohibition, because we all know how well that went. There were attempts at pushing prohibition well before the Civil War, but it never really gained any traction until after 1865. In 69, the Prohibition Party was created. In 1881, Kansas's constitution prohibited the consumption of alcohol. So Kansas was the first dry state. I'm sure that was an exciting... Kansas doesn't have anything, y'all. Come on. It's a flat state with, like, wheat. That's it. There's nothing in Kansas. Once again, women were a major force behind this change, forming the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Frances Willard led the group until 1898. She used the platform for women's suffrage, child labor laws, labor unions, but after she died, they went back to just working on temperance. Again, if you're not catching the context here, temperance just means prohibition. 1893, Anti-Saloon League, ASL, was the group in the South, so South and West. Between 1906 and 1917, 21 states banned liquor sales, largely in the South and West. The 18th Amendment was passed in 1919 and made prohibition the law of the land, and nothing bad ever happened ever. The principles of the Prohibition Party, a little town and a big-ass church. You could fit all the buildings of the town inside that church. What is happening? Prohibitionists to Cary County. Yeah, the Prohibition Party didn't last very long. But what's interesting is they have a little animal for their symbol, too. It's a camel, as you can see, because, camels don't need to drink a lot. I mean, technically, they drink a whole lot, and then they just don't for a long time. But, whatever. It was creative. Here's the thing that I wanted to show you guys since, the beginning of the semester. The Drunkard's Progress. You got a glass with a friend, a glass to keep the cold out, a glass too much, drunk and riotous, and then the summit achieved, jolly companions, a confirmed drunkard, and then we start going downhill, poverty and disease, forsaken by friends, desperation and crime, and then he just caps himself with his flintlock, looks like a flintlock pistol there. And then down here in the bottom, the whole time we have his wife and child have lost everything because the husband has drank away all the money. This is just the Prohibition Party has basically lost all control over the idea of the prohibition. Yeah, the Prohibition Party didn't last very long, but the idea of prohibition ran away on its own. Help me keep him pure. Please vote no license. Yeah, there's a lot of think of the children. There's so many think of the children things. Vote no on liquor for our sake. Oh no. Here's the Women's Christian Temperance Union. The saloon or the boys and girls. Think of the children. This one was during World War I. Will you back me or back booze? It's like, that. What does that have to do with anything? I mean, I guess technically, if we're not making alcohol, we've got more grain and we could send that over, I guess. But I don't think any soldiers in World War I really cared. This one's funny. Daddy's in there, and our shoes and stockings and clothes and food are in there too, and they'll never come out because Daddy's drinking away all our money. Oh no. U.S. has voted dry. 36th state ratifies amendment, yada, yada, yada. I like the subtitle here. A saloonless nation and a stainless flag, because, you know, the only thing America's ever done wrong is drink alcohol. The only thing America's ever done wrong. There's the Crusade Against Vice, but we'll do that next week, I guess. Yeah, because today is Wednesday, isn't it? All right, see y'all Monday. Have a good weekend.